I locate my work specifically at the intersection of international relations theory, Canadian politics, and security studies. And my interest of my research is looking at the way that imaginaries of the Arctic are shaping or interrelating with Canada's governance strategy in terms of defense in the Arctic. So more specifically, I wanted to look at how surveillance technology is being focused upon and within this defense strategy, and specifically why Canada has really chosen or seems to be emphasizing this as a route to its governance in the Arctic. And also maybe more emphatically in this presentation, how these technologies are evolving, what the research and development around them looks like, and what maybe some of the consequences theoretically, empirically, of that development is for Arctic security. And so my argument can be subdivided into really kind of two broad arguments. So the first one is that I'm arguing current technological developments are grounded in a particular social technical imaginary that I think is very unique, and that it's countered by the future-oriented considerations that are really kind of dominating the Arctic right now. And also, this orientation to me is leading to a very specific governance strategy by the Canadian state based on preemption, which implicitly or explicitly premises or prioritizes techniques of sensing in terms of these technologies that are being used and developed. And so just to begin, what are imaginaries? And so there's been actually a ton of work already done on Arctic imaginaries, specifically around the ideas that the translation of place into space, they're typically the ways that the Arctic is dehistoricized as a place, usually through a colonial lens, in terms of which all the other presentations really did very well, demonstrating how colonialism is very much premised on specific values and specific systems of meaning. And this is kind of the conventional understanding of what we mean by imaginaries, and specifically one that I draw from Donnie's idea of these systems of meaning that are kind of layered and create very unique understandings and representations of the world. I bring in a little bit more of a different view to it, in the sense that I'm specifically focused on the future. So rather than just specifically a dehistoricized view of the world, I'm looking at how the future is invoked as a structural characteristic of the world. And in addition to that, I use Bourdieu's understanding of the field to really look at how imaginaries are political projects, in the sense that they involve not just cultural or imaginative understandings of the world, but they're very based and recirculated in terms of their epistemic practices. And so really Bourdieu's understanding gives us the idea that these imaginaries involve matrices of power and knowledge. And so specifically, I'm looking at this idea of the new Arctic. And so I'm just going to read this quote here. The new Arctic is a term used to capture the view that large changes observed in the Arctic climate system in recent decades are both dramatic and unlikely to reverse in the foreseeable future. And this is, I think, a really interesting quote in the sense that it is epistemic and it's based out of the natural sciences. The basic understanding is that the Arctic, through climate change, is undergoing very quickly massive transformation that in turn will actually affect the climatic transformation of the world more broadly. And this new Arctic, that's the idea of the new Arctic, not necessarily the new Arctic in itself, is really interesting because it's really characteristic of the way the future is invoked in terms of the Arctic's imaginative frontier. And so the new is really distinctive in this sense. And of course, as I just mentioned, the idea of epistemic or scientific indicators is really important to this idea. So loss of biodiversity, rising global temperatures or rising Arctic temperatures, which are being experienced much more quickly, in turn contributing to things like the melting permafrost, which also in turn will affect climate system, or through the release of greenhouse gases, of course, affect the climatic transformation of the world more broadly, is really kind of indicative of what this new Arctic is. And in some, the idea is that it's really altering the bios of the Arctic in terms of its ability to host life and the specific forms of life and living that are actually possible in the Arctic, not just for humans, but for all species that currently exist in tundra ecosystems. And within the narrative of international relations theory and security studies in Canadian politics, we see a lot of discourse around how the Arctic, because of melting permafrost and melting ice sheets and so forth, is really being primed to become a region that's going to be ripe for economic exploitation in the near future or distant future. And so things like resource exploitation is kind of the most obvious, between oil reserves, natural gas, minerals. Then, of course, travel routes, shortening the distance from Pacific Asia, really in turn bringing the Arctic into this kind of global space of flows, basically completing, in a sense, this idea of a globalization as a shrunken planet, the political project, in terms of its spatial homogenization. And it's really interesting to see how the future is brought into discourse within kind of defense policy. And so this is a diagram from, it's called the Canada-US Threat Matrix Arctic Cube Framework, representing emerging Arctic threats from the Eyes North QED workshop, which, so it's basically, this was a concept built from professionals from the Department of National Defense in conjunction with some other security practitioners in the United States. And the idea was to invoke this kind of risk framework for the Arctic in terms of its threats, or what threats are likely to present themselves in the near to distant future. And so we look down here, the most interesting, or the highest, most urgent threat are what they call dark targets. And so dark targets are basically just, we see them in terms of marine navigation, most obviously the ships that they would say are non-emitting, so they don't have an official broadcast signature. They may be traveling at night, so they are trying to avoid detection by existing surveillance technologies or surveillance capabilities. They otherwise embrace a very kind of nefarious quality to them. And in contrast, we see at the the lowest or least urgent spectrum here, the opposite, the permafrost thaw that is actually occurring via climate change, via these warming temperatures. So it's interesting to see how specifically D&D and the security sector within Canada is really framing its understanding of threats in terms of the priorities, I should say. And I think it's really important to outline these, because so one of my arguments is that within this kind of future-oriented imaginary of the Arctic, it's really underpinned by two interrelated themes: threat and vulnerability. And so within that kind of understanding of threat and vulnerability, risk is really the overarching knowledge matrix that we're looking at, or that is being used to frame the future of the Arctic, to frame it as a space of intervention for state governance. And so the notion of risk isn't a new thing. Beck famously talked about the risk society in the early 90s, but it wasn't really until the post 9/11 environment that September 11th, 2001, I mean, in terms of risk being actually incorporated into security practices. Now, 9/11 is really important. It's kind of this threshold moment where it was understood to be a failure of imagination by by not just the US intelligence community, but the global intelligence community. And so it's really interesting to see how the Arctic is conceived in a similar way. And so when we talk about the future, we're talking about the Arctic in terms of the 22nd century. We're talking really far into the future in some cases. And we see this kind of imaginary really emphasized in, for instance, like former Prime Minister Stephen Harper's discourse. He talked about Canadians of the 22nd century demanding preemptive action in the 21st century. And so the way I understand futurity is both this imaginative quality, but also very epistemic quality, in the sense it involves formal relations of power and knowledge making. And so preemption becomes the preferred strategy of this future imaginative Arctic. And just to quickly look at theoretically what I mean by preemption. So preemption and prevention are related but very different in some ways. And so I draw a lot of my inspiration here from Brian Massamy and David Chandler, who talks about the Anthropocene. So really they are important. They're different in the sense that they are reliant on different ontologies and epistemologies. And so prevention as like a strategy is really dependent on this idea of an objective, knowable world. It has very linear, discrete relations that we can intervene in. And so it's the idea that we can actually stop a threat before it necessarily emerges in a very proactive, reactive, or less reactive, proactive sense, versus preemption, which actually understands the world to be much more relational. It's flattened in terms of its ontology, and therefore it's much more complicated. So actually preventing something from happening for instance, the emergence of terrorism becomes much more problematic. It becomes really difficult. And so we're forced to rely much more on reactive strategies of intervention. And so it's this idea of mastery. We've seen it a lot in terms of like the industrial mastery of control sort of narratives versus the loss of control. And this is where David Chandler becomes really interesting. He talks about how the Anthropocene is this understanding, and our preferred strategy of dealing with climate change is just this idea that we can't stop it. It's too late. And so the best we can do is adapt to it, to be resilient in the face of these types of changes. And this is where you see a lot of the discourses around resilience come out of. And so very simply put, it's about causation versus correlation. And so sensing is really an important practice towards preemption, because it's this idea that to be able to manage that environment, to be able to operate within that environment, we have to kind of know the world that we're actually dealing with as much as humanly possible. And so sensing as an actual practice is premised on two sub-practices that are, can be looked at across two vectors, space and time. So the first one, surveillance, is probably the most obvious or the most important one in terms of actually kind of illuminating the world. And so within the Arctic, we see a lot of efforts being directed towards illuminating the Arctic in both the visible spectrum, so just using light, but also the sub or non-visible spectrum, so things like infrared, hyperspectral imaging, that sort of thing. And then the idea to again illuminate the Arctic as an environment, also every object within it, both human-made and natural. And the intelligence aspect of that is about making events or correlating events between different data points. And so when you actually map that across time, it becomes the idea that we can look at disparate data points or disparate things that might not actually have much relation to one another at first glance, but actually do on second glance. And so going back to the 9/11 example, it's this idea, had we actually bothered to look in the right places, we might have actually had an idea that this could happen, or at least indicated that there was this risk, no matter how small it was. So if we had looked at things like financial records, monitored flight training patterns, that sort of thing. And so through this kind of logic, we can actually create things that they for instance, patterns of life. The idea that we can actually map or predict behaviors of specific objects when we see them. From a threat matrix, we can actually look at things like create elements, things like heat maps, the idea of measuring in terms of just giving a geospatial dimension to where those risks or those threats might actually emerge. And so just to give kind of a grounded example of how this is actually occurring in Canada, we see this kind of broad understanding that there needs to be both the integration of existing systems, so what they would call off-the-shelf technologies, with kind of more revolutionary research and development efforts. Things are especially oriented around quantum computing, that sort of thing. But from the existing surveillance perspective, it's really interesting to see how developed the Arctic is already in terms of its surveillance capacity with respect to civilian systems. And so it really kind of juxtaposes against that idea that the Arctic is this the classic imaginary of the Arctic as this void or vacant space. And so the top diagram here, excuse me. The top diagram here is the Canadian High Arctic Ionospheric Network stations, which is operated by the University of New Brunswick, which basically looks for ionospheric disturbances in the Arctic atmosphere. So the Arctic atmosphere is plagued with these ionospheric disturbances, which this is the bottom right here is a real-time map that anybody can generate. It's civilian access to these maps. And this is important from a defense consideration because these types of disturbances are routinely identified as being problematic for electronic communications. So things like basically command and communications, C2 is the defense acronym, is premised on being able to, on these technologies that we're basically reliant upon. And from an Arctic security perspective, this becomes very problematic. So you can see why an institution like the Department of Defense would actually care about this type of surveillance. And on the left here is a surveillance map of existing and predicted environmental surveillance sensors for the Year of the Polar Prediction Project, which is just a conglomeration of various scientific studies that are undergoing, but it's basically used for environmental and weather monitoring. And so again, this is important because this data set, or the data sets that are produced by these environmental sensors, have been identified by D&D as very important to their own considerations. And so we're seeing this increasing reliance upon civilian integration into defense concerns. And on the second aspect of that kind of sensing equation, intelligence, the example I'm using I thought was really interesting is this product called Blue Hawk. And so it's a product actually developed by a Canadian firm, MDA Incorporated, under the Arctic Maritime Awareness for Safety and Security program. And it's marketed towards sovereignty protection. And this is a quote I took from one of its advertisements, is detecting maritime threats as far from shore as possible, and which this product can detect dark targets globally. So again, we see that invocation of the idea of dark targets. And the idea that we can detect these targets globally is very important in terms of considerations of both conceptually what we mean by territory and sovereignty, and how we actually apply that in terms of our Arctic considerations. So it's not just focusing on the Arctic as a region with even in Canadian territory, but again, the idea conceptually to expand the consolidation of Canadian territory in the Arctic as a global practice. And so the second aspect of Blue Hawk is a secondary product called, and I'm hoping I don't butcher the pronunciation of this, is Kilotuk. So Kilotuk in Inuktitut means scraper in a very traditional sense, like a bowl scraper. But within this concept, it's actually a web scraper. And so the basic idea is that it's taking developments in natural language processing and combine that with publicly available text search software, things like Lucene, which is a program. I think it's used by Adobe for, like, if you search for a word within a PDF file. And the idea then is to integrate that sort of web scraping data with existing other, again, civilian and proprietary databases like the GeoNames database to create these kind of data files. And specifically through like proprietary data, RCM, which is the RadarSat Constellation mission, which is I could do a whole talk about that, but the RCM is also a satellite developed by MDA Incorporated. It's currently owned by the Canadian government, and it's geared specifically towards surveillance in different capacities, both within the Arctic, but in other areas of the world. And so it's interesting to see how these are combining in towards creating this kind of all domain situational awareness picture of the Arctic, and very much using preemption as a strategy to like intervene within that as a space of governance. And this is specifically where we see the role of artificial intelligence come. It's because the world is so complex. It is so complex, especially when you take the application of actors multiplied by the geography potentially of the world, if not outside the world, in terms of like going into space, the militarization of space, and then multiplied that by time, not just like in the next few years, but again, increasingly into the far future. And we're talking 20, 30 years, 100 years from now. It's almost impossible for human conception to really make sense of that. And so artificial intelligence is being positioned broadly in terms of like, all functions, whether it's like machine learning or machine vision, deep learning, neural network stuff. It's really positioned as this is going to be the answer towards making the Arctic a governable space in terms of security and technology, security and defense, excuse me. And so technology is really critical to preemption as a strategy of state power. And I think it has a lot of applications or a lot of implications for how we think about sovereignty, specifically as a material application. It's material practice. So again, sovereignty is now really, sovereignty is always about pushing outward, but now it's really about pushing outward much farther, both temporally and spatially. And just to kind of summarize my conclusions, I'm arguing that futurity embodies both this, again, imaginative quality, which is cultural value, normative aspects, but also very epistemic quality. So, and that includes things like international relations theory and security studies as like formal disciplines, but also things like risk calculations and other empirical scientific indicators, which we see a lot in things like the insurance industry. And the combination of these two things are really shaping the forms of state power in the Arctic, including, I think, the design and role that these technologies are expected to play as an expression of sovereign power, of state power. And so again, sovereignty is really characterized by this increasingly spatial and temporal dimension that is quite novel, and we haven't quite seen it yet. And lastly, just include just my funding disclosure. It's supported, my research is supported by SSHRC and the D&D through their joint initiative, the Mobilizing Insights in Defense and Security program, MINDS, and Fulbright Canada. And I will end it there. Thank you.